Hello and welcome to another episode of Reviews Redux, where I take another look at one of my older reviews and bring it up to my more current quality standards. Today I'm taking another look at Half-Life, along with both of its expansion packs, Opposing Force and Blue Shift, and while the original game was released for PC, Mac, Linux, and PlayStation 2, the expansion packs were only for PC, Mac, and Linux. Obviously, everything that you'll be seeing here was from the PC versions. This is a first-person shooter and the first entry in the Half-Life series. It was developed by Valve and originally published by Sierra, although Valve later would publish it themselves, and it was first released in November of 1998 exclusively for PC, with a PlayStation 2 follow-up in 2001. The expansion pack Opposing Force was released in 1999 exclusively for PC, and Blue Shift would follow in 2001, but both of those expansion packs were developed by Gearbox Software instead of Valve. And while the original Half-Life has gone on to receive classic status among the general gaming populace and is generally considered one of the best games ever made by a very large number of people, the expansion packs get quite a bit less attention, especially Blue Shift, but Opposing Force was actually very well received in its day, and even Blue Shift was well received in its day, although it was less well received than both its predecessor expansion and, of course, the base game. Now, before I start delving into this thing, I do have to bring up a few things. First, this game came out over 20 years ago. A lot has happened between then and now. We have seen a lot of games come and go, we've seen a lot of trends come and go. But Half-Life really was a milestone in the development of first-person shooters. It was considered the start of a new era, where you basically had the pre-Half-Life era and the post-Half-Life era. And while I'll explain a bit more of that when I get to the story and the gameplay parts of the review, I do want to give you a bit of a primer to say that the pre-Half-Life era is heavily categorized by very fast-paced, very arcadey first-person shooters that have basically no story whatsoever, and the post-Half-Life era is more or less the opposite of that, where it's a lot slower paced and it's a lot more story oriented. That said, while the era separation of pre and post Half-Life is certainly very valid to this day, the amount of hype that's been generated around Half-Life and just the Half-Life series in general over the ensuing years has gotten so completely out of control that it's created one of the most rabid fan bases I have ever seen in gaming, and more importantly, it has effectively overhyped its own series to death. That's right, the amount of hype that has been generated around the Half-Life series is so completely absurd that it's at the point where if Half-Life 3 were to actually happen, there is no possible way it could ever live up to the expectations that the fanbase has. I mean, sure, we're getting Half-Life Alyx, but that's a VR spin-off title, and it's going to be treated as such, because it's set between Half-Life 1 and 2, and it's not a continuation of the main storyline like people were really expecting. And even with it being treated as a sort of spin-off title and it being VR only, which means that it's going to have a rather limited amount of people who actually can play the thing, I have a distinct feeling that the fanbase is just going to tear it apart because it's just not Half-Life 3 and it's just not perfection, because VR is still in a pretty early stage. So of course that raises a question of how exactly did we get to this point? What is it that Half-Life 1 and Half-Life 2 do that makes them such widely beloved and widely overhyped games? Well, let's go ahead and start delving right into this and find out. And like always, we'll go ahead and start with the presentation, which runs on the Gold Source engine. This was basically a heavily modified Quake 1 engine, and that does show in numerous respects, namely with regards to the rather low texture quality. It also has some very blocky and simplistic weapon models with some smooth but still simplistic animations, and the character models are also very blocky and rather ugly. The thing is, the original Half-Life was never really much of a looker as far as raw visual fidelity goes. What it actually had going for it was the rather large amount of detail in the environments, where you would go through these locations and they actually resembled real locations that you could conceivably think of as an actual full-scale research facility. There's even a rudimentary physics system where you can move around crates and barrels, at least some of them anyway, in order to set up ambushes or, more importantly, to set up jumping platforms to make it easier to get to certain areas, and that is of course used in the game's puzzle-solving elements. elements. On top of all of that, the engine itself is extremely scalable, and Valve has continued to put out updates on occasion in order to make sure it stays functional on modern hardware and modern operating systems, and of course there's things like being able to play the game at 1080p without a single problem. That's not to say that the engine doesn't have its problems, of course, and it doesn't have its weird quirks, but most of those come up more in the gameplay than anything else, and the only thing you're really going to notice as far as general presentation or first impressions go is that the mouse input can be a bit finicky, and you have to enable raw mouse input in order for it not to just spaz out on you. Now, of course, when Half-Life Opposing Force released, it had a bunch of new content that was up to the same quality standards as the original Half-Life. In fact, some of it is actually a bit better looking. And then by the time Blue Shift came out, the engine was looking very dated, so the Blue Shift expansion included the high-definition models pack, which completely overhauls the character models and the weapon models, so they are at a much higher polygon count than what you had in the original version of the engine. The thing is, while it more or less works fine for the character models, when you get to the actual weapon models, they changed up a lot of them, so they don't even really look appropriate anymore. For example, the 9mm pistol in the base game and the Opposing Force expansion is very clearly a Glock, but if you get the high-definition pack installed, then it's switched over to a Beretta, which doesn't make any sense because it has more rounds in the magazine than it's actually supposed to. Even weirder is what they did to the MP5. You see, in the original game in Opposing Force, you had an MP5 with an underslung grenade launcher, which makes no sense, but whatever. And if you move over to the high-definition pack, that is completely replaced by an M4 assault rifle with an M203 grenade launcher attached to it, which ordinarily would be fine, except that it still uses the same 9mm ammunition that the submachine gun used, which is also shared with the 9mm pistol, so it's downright absurd. There's also a few other oddities with the HD pack, most notably things like the 357 Magnum not actually rotating the cylinder or cocking the hammer when you fire the gun, or even introducing weird sound glitches where when you reload the Magnum, for example, it doesn't play any sound effect at all with the HD pack, whereas it only played one sound effect in the base game. And speaking of sounds, it does actually change up some of the sound effects when you change over to the high definition pack, so that is something else to keep in mind. Although the new sound effects are really more of a matter of personal preference than anything else, they're actually more or less the same quality as those in the base game, so there's not too much to complain about there unless you just don't particularly like the sounds personally. And speaking of sounds, the sound design in general actually works out rather well in the game and still holds up reasonably well, although the sound quality itself is still quite low. That's really more of a problem of its era than anything else, and you'll find that most games of that era had issues with the sound quality being relatively low, and there's not a whole lot you can do about it without completely replacing all of the sound effects in the game with much higher quality recorded versions, which obviously is quite a big undertaking, so they just never did that. That said, the gun and explosion sounds are actually pretty decent for the era and hold up reasonably well despite the sound quality issues, and the sound effects you'll be running into as you just run around and interact with things and whack things in the environment or whatever the case may be also work out pretty well. You've got some pretty nice alien sound effects that sound suitably alien when you run into those characters, and all things considered, the voice acting is actually pretty decent as well, with some characters that admittedly all sound pretty much the same because they had maybe 4 or 5 voice actors in total doing all of the characters throughout, but it's not like a lot of games from the 90s that did feature voice acting where the voice acting was so incredibly terrible that you would either just burst out laughing the entire time, or it was so incredibly terrible that it was just grating on your nerves. But at the same time, it's definitely not the kind of thing that you would see winning awards. And then of course there's the soundtrack, which is primarily composed of electronic tunes that are either trying to generate some ambiance or are just giving you some cheesy action tunes, and they generally work out pretty well, although very little of it is actually memorable. And even though the HD pack does switch around some of the sound effects for certain weapons, everything is actually very consistent across the board. You're going to see that the base game and both of the expansions all sound very, very similar to one another, to the point where even though you had different teams working on them, it does feel like one cohesive sound vision, and more importantly, the quality is very consistent. And when you bring all of that together, you find that the presentation across the base game and both of the expansion packs actually holds up reasonably well, all things considered. I mean, sure, it's ugly by modern standards, and it looks positively archaic, and it definitely sounds archaic in a lot of ways, but as long as you're able to put up with the fact that it is a well over 20-year-old game at this point, it's pretty easy to look past all of that. But as well as the presentation holds up in some regards, what really matters here are the story and the gameplay. And the story in this is that you play as Dr. Gordon Freeman, who works at the Black Mesa Research Facility in the Anomalous Materials Division, where they are researching strange materials that have been brought back from this alternate dimension known as Zen. And after a fairly lengthy intro sequence where Gordon rides the tram to his work destination, he dons a hazardous environment suit, or HEV suit for short, and sets about yet another day of testing strange materials from an alternate dimension and trying to get a grasp on teleporter technology. The thing is, the experiment goes horribly wrong and ends up opening a portal to the other dimension where aliens from that dimension spill forth into the Black Mesa Research Facility and start killing everybody on sight. Gordon is knocked out during the initial events of this and wakes up to find the facility in shambles and relatively few survivors, and he also finds out that a detachment of Marines has been sent into the facility, and at first it seems like they're there to rescue everybody, but it turns out they're actually there to cover everything up and eliminate both the alien threat and any of the facility's employees that they come across. And thus the main story of the game is actually fighting your way through the facility and trying to find a way to escape. And for a game that's considered to be story-driven like this, it's not a particularly complex or interesting plot. It's more the way in which it's told that was groundbreaking for the time. Where from the beginning of the game until the very end, you have almost completely uninterrupted control over Gordon, and you are seeing all of the events unfold from his eyes. Of course, Gordon himself isn't really much of a character, considering he never speaks throughout the entire Half-Life series, and really serves to do not much more than be a player avatar for observing all the events unfolding. But when you consider the fact that the norm for first-person shooters at the time was to really not have much of a story at all, if it even had one, and to focus entirely on gameplay, it's definitely a very different take on the first-person shooter than everybody was used to. And even though the story itself is nothing particularly impressive and the characters are basically non-existent, the way in which the story of Half-Life was told showed that the first-person shooter genre actually had promise as a conveyor of storyline and of immersing you in a world and immersing you in a storyline. In other words, it showed that first-person shooters are more than simply dumb action entertainment. And that, more than anything else, is why you have the divide of the pre-Half-Life and post-Half-Life first-person shooter genre. Pre-Half-Life, it was generally considered to be just dumb, mindless entertainment that was very fun, but was entirely focused on gameplay, and it didn't really need a storyline, and you didn't really expect a storyline or really any intelligence out of a first-person shooter. Half-Life was not only the proof of concept that this was a very pitifully narrow view of the genre, but it was also the catalyst for a new era of first-person shooters, where developers realized, hey, we can actually make this work, and they tried to set about ways of making it work. A lot of them were not very successful, admittedly, but it did set things in motion for later games that would pull that sort of thing off. But here's the thing. As well as this pulled off being the proof of concept for that idea, there's really not a huge amount of story that's actually in the game. Most of the time you're actually just going to be playing through the levels and engaging in the combat loop as well as the puzzle solving. So how is the gameplay in this? Well, it is a first-person shooter, and you do get access to a variety of weapons in the pretty traditional style of that time. You'll have an arsenal ranging from your trusty crowbar to your basic 9mm pistol to a .357 Magnum, a shotgun that strangely enough can fire 2 barrels at once even though there's only 1 barrel because it's a SPAS-12, but whatever, they don't know how guns work. Then of course there's the iconic MP5 with a grenade launcher mounted underneath it, which is absurd, and the rocket launcher, which you can guide by using the laser that's attached to it, or even the crossbow that basically serves as the game's sniper rifle. And while some of the choices are a bit questionable as far as realism goes, they all feel like they fit in the universe and make sense. But there is one major problem with them. That is that you will only be using maybe 3 weapons throughout the vast majority of the game. Those being the .357 Magnum, the MP5 with a grenade launcher on it, and the shotgun. Those 3 weapons will get you through pretty much every single combat encounter in the game, and whenever you do need to switch to something else, it's a very situational thing. For example, you need to take down a heavily armored opponent, so you'll switch over to your explosive weapons, or you're fighting an enemy that's very far away, so you switch over to the crossbow to be able to get that zoom zoom factor in. But most of the time you're going to be going back and forth between the 3 weapons that I mentioned before because they're just the best for generally every single combat encounter you'll be in, and more importantly, some of the weapons that you think might be more useful actually end up not being that way. For example, grenades. You would think those would be very useful for taking out groups of enemies, but the throwing physics on them are downright atrocious even for the time, and so it's really difficult to actually be able to hit anything with them. Satchel charges are more of a liability than an asset unless you're just trying to destroy a bunch of crates or something, and the trip mines, well, you're never going to find a use for those, let's be honest. There are a couple of science fiction weapons available that are pretty satisfying to use, those being the Tau cannon and especially the gluon gun, but ammo for them is rather sparing, so you're probably not going to be using much of those unless you come across particularly powerful enemies that you need to take out very quickly. This is why I say that the Magnum, the submachine gun, and the shotgun are the primary weapons you're going to be using, because ammo for them is pretty plentiful, and they're very effective at a variety of situations. But even with that specific combination of weapons, you're going to find very quickly that the shooting mechanics in this game are just really not very good. Outside of things like the head crab zombies, the head crabs themselves, and the vortigaunts, most of the enemies in this are fairly bullet spongy, and they can be very frustrating to deal with at times. Especially the human enemies, because all of their weapons are hit scan, and you pretty much can't avoid taking damage when you're going up against them. Now sure, the game is not exactly stingy with the health and energy pickups, where energy is what replaces your armor in this, and you do have these various stations that are scattered around the levels where you can go up to them and hold down the use key on them to slowly recharge up to a certain point, but there are still certain instances where the game throws an awful lot at you, and unless you knew what you were going into to begin with, there's a very good chance you just get your ass handed to you. This is a game where, oddly enough, I really don't recommend playing on the hard mode, because all the hard mode does is increase the amount of damage the enemies do and the amount of damage they can take, which makes the core combat loop even more tedious than it already is. This is especially important the further you get into the game, because even though the combat encounters in the early game are mostly fine, once you start to get around the halfway point, they start ramping up the amount of enemies that you're fighting and the amount of very spongy enemies that you're fighting, and strangely enough, you just start to dread the next combat encounter, not because it's going to be difficult or anything, but because it's just going to be tiresome. You're going to be sitting there wailing on enemies for a disproportionately long amount of time before they go down, and it's just not very satisfying. Now, there are certainly far worse FPS mechanics out there, but Half-Life was never really known for being a mechanically strong first-person shooter to begin with, and that does actually end up being a pretty glaring problem when the game is as long as it is, and the vast majority of it is the combat. This, of course, brings me to the rest of the gameplay mechanics, which consists of puzzle solving and platforming, and puzzle solving in this particular game is so incredibly bare bones that it might as well not even be in there at all. It mostly consists of either moving some crates around so you can jump on some things, or maybe moving a platform so you can jump on it, or maybe you just have to trigger things in a certain order, but there's not really much to that. And then more importantly, you're going to be doing an awful lot of platforming in this, with controls that just aren't very good. The movement has a slightly floaty quality to it, and more importantly, the jumping itself is just plain awkward. You have to remember that this is the game that brought us crouch jumping, where in order to reach certain heights, you have to jump and then press the crouch key so you can get up on top of whatever it is you're trying to jump on, and this was an intended gameplay feature. It's just a strange mechanic that was even strange back when this originally released, and it only gets worse once you gain access to the jump module, which is right before you go to Zen. You see, Zen has a very alien landscape with a lot of floating platforms, which means that you need this jump module to be able to basically glide between the platforms. And in order to trigger this, you have to crouch and jump at basically the same time. It's a really weird control, it never worked especially well, and strangely enough, the PlayStation 2 version of the game actually does it better, where all you have to do is press and hold the jump button. Now again, I've gone through far worse platforming in first-person shooters before, but in this particular game, it just becomes incredibly frustrating, especially once you get to Zen, which is basically all of the worst elements of the game folded into one particularly long area. It throws a lot of the really spongy enemies at you. It has a lot of really awkward and annoying platforming segments. It has some puzzle solving, which is mostly just a bunch of trial and error and just ends up being annoying more than anything else. And like certain other areas in the game, it just drags on for far too long. This is a problem you'll run into in several sections of the game, most notably once you get around the midway point, where you start having particularly long levels like Blast Pit, which seems really cool at first because you're fighting this giant tentacle monster thing, and then it just continues to drag on and on as you have to basically run around it and find all sorts of different stations that you need to activate before you can actually flip a switch to kill the thing. Or you get onto the On a Rail sequence, where you're going around on the tram system, which seems cool at first, until it just keeps going. Or the Residue Processing level, which is an extended sequence of nothing but platforming. And then finally you get to Zen, which is the final act of the game, and it lasts for 3 entire levels of nothing but platforming and weird level geometry and really obnoxious combat. At first you look at it and you're like, wow, this is really cool from an aesthetic standpoint, and then the reality starts to set in and you realize that you're in for a very long, very tedious slog. And that is precisely the point where a lot of people will simply stop playing the game, because it wasn't exactly all that fun leading up to that, and once Zen kicks in, it's just not fun at all anymore. So what you end up with in the original Half-Life is a really weird experience where the game actually peaks very early on in the campaign, and it just continues to get worse the further you get into it. Sure, you get access to a bunch of additional weaponry the further you get in, and you're fighting more varied enemies the further you get in, but you're also fighting a lot of enemies that are just extremely annoying. I mean, headcrabs are always annoying from the very beginning of the game on, and then of course you have things like the snarks, which are just downright infuriating. But as if it wasn't enough that they throw some very fast, small enemies at you that are pretty hard to hit, they also have the hit scanners, like the Marines that you'll be going up against, or they have the enemies that have seeking projectiles like the alien grunts, and between these different enemy types and the general encounter designs where they tend to spawn them in just from teleporting them in either behind you or in front of you or whatever the case may be, and you can in fact be telefragged, by the way, in case you didn't know that, it makes you wonder if they just didn't understand how irritating all of that was, or if they deliberately went into the game to try to make it as annoying as possible at times. It certainly doesn't help that you do have certain sequences where you have to get your AI teammates to help you out, whether that be a security guard or a scientist, where they have to go up to a door panel and activate it in order for you to be able to progress. And of course the AI is not especially great, so sometimes they get stuck on things and you have to go back and find them and activate them again to be able to get them following you again, and that just becomes annoying as well. Although thankfully those particular sequences are relatively few and far between at least. But all of it brought together makes the original Half-Life a really weird experience, where you'll be playing for the first, say, 5 or 6 chapters and be getting into it, and then it just starts to drag on and get worse and worse, and eventually you're just downright annoyed with it. It's really an instance where they went all in on one particular thing, and they did that reasonably well, that being the storytelling, and everything else in the game actually suffered for it quite heavily. And while a lot of people were willing to overlook that back in 1998 simply because the storytelling was so novel and groundbreaking, unfortunately it means that the game really has not aged well at all. A lot of those smaller elements that were easily overlooked back in 1998 just end up making the game an absolutely frustrating experience when you go back and try to play it now, which is why ultimately I really can't recommend going back and playing the original Half-Life other than as a historical curiosity. It's certainly a very interesting game for its time, and it was certainly groundbreaking when it released, but again, it just has not aged well at all, and it's just not a very fun game to play anymore. This of course leads me to the expansion packs, which were not developed by Valve, they were developed by Gearbox Software. So how did they take what Valve did and either change things or try to improve upon things or add on to it? Well, we'll start with the first released expansion pack, which is Opposing Force, where you play as Corporal Adrian Shepard, one of the Marines that's sent into the Black Mesa facility in order to pacify it. But before he can receive his orders, the Osprey he's flying in on gets shot down by alien attacks, and he ends up waking up after being rescued by one of the scientists, and from there it's a matter of getting back together with the troops he flew in with and trying to find a way to escape the Black Mesa facility. But since he never received the orders to take out the employees of the facility, he actually ends up working together with them in order to try to find a way out. And eventually when he does link back up with fellow soldiers, he finds out that they are all pulling out of the facility because they deem the entire thing a lost cause. So thus begins the frantic battle to try to find a way out out of the facility after being basically cut off from the rest of the force. It's more or less the same storyline that you saw in the original Half-Life, just from a slightly different perspective, that of one of the soldiers that flew in before he managed to get his orders. And you end up finding out that Gearbox, strangely enough, was actually better at this than Valve was. Because even though the storytelling is very similar, the pacing of the Opposing Force campaign is leagues better than the pacing of the base game. And more importantly, it doesn't have an extended Zen segment at the end of the game that makes things absolutely miserable. And since it hits pretty much all the same notes that the base game's campaign did, you actually find that it's more or less a heavily condensed and much tighter paced version of the base game, and it just ends up actually playing a hell of a lot better as a result. There's almost no segments in the entirety of the expansion where it feels like things are just dragging on, even when they're doing things that the base game did itself, like the fight against the worm in this, where it's more or less the same exact type of boss fight that you had against the tentacle monster in the base game, but instead of the rather long, drawn-out, and frankly boring way you have to go about taking out that thing in the base game, in Opposing Force it's actually pretty quick. It really does speak to the value of not wasting the player's time, because even though Half-Life Opposing Force is definitely a shorter campaign than the base game, in fact it's about half the length of the base game, it's a much tighter, much more enjoyable experience overall, not simply because the pacing's a hell of a lot better, but because they designed the combat encounters a lot better as well. Not only will you be going up against a lot more enemies that are not hit scan, and you can actually dodge the projectiles of, but you'll actually be going up against these enemies with help from AI squad mates, which actually have surprisingly decent AI for the time, although they still get stuck on things all the time and have a really nasty habit of getting themselves killed all the time, but that's beside the point. And they also give you a selection of new weapons to mess around with on top of the ones that you get from the base game. You see, instead of the 357 Magnum, you get a Desert Eagle, which is actually quite a lot more useful, and even has a laser aiming module on it that will allow you to get more precise shots out of it. Or you have the M249 machine gun, which is basically the submachine gun on steroids and actually ends up being rather satisfying to use compared to the frankly pretty wimpy submachine gun. You also gain access to a sniper rifle in this that replaces the crossbow, and it's actually hit scan as opposed to the projectile base that the crossbow is, which makes it actually more useful. And you even get a couple of science fiction or alien weapons of your own, like the displacer cannon, which basically teleports enemies away when you launch it at enemies, and the spore launcher, which is a fish-like creature that spits out spores that explode on contact, or the shock roach, which is a weapon you gain from killing shock troopers, and then it spits out these electrical blasts that are actually rather powerful, and it even recharges itself over time. And all of these new weapons and the ones that they change over from the base game make you feel a lot more confident when you go into combat here, where you feel like you can really dish out some damage compared to the original game. And since the vast majority of the enemies you're going to be fighting are not the obnoxious hit scan marines like in the base game, it actually ends up making the combat quite a lot more enjoyable. Although they do still try to ruin that to some degree by throwing you up against the Black Ops soldiers, which you did see a bit of in the base game, but they were just a very limited thing. Here they're a lot more common, and you normally have a squad to deal with them, so it actually ends up not being that big of a deal. Now, of course, it is an expansion pack to the original Half-Life, which means that all the weird engine quirks and all the weird things with regards to crouch jumping and all that still applies here, but they actually ended up making an expansion pack that, strangely enough, is actually better than the base game, because it understands what the original game does well, but also what didn't work in the original Half-Life. And while some of that they really can't avoid, they did try to capitalize more on what actually worked in the original Half-Life than what didn't, and you end up with more or less the game that Half-Life should have been from the start, where the campaign doesn't feel like it drags on and on, it feels perfectly paced, it doesn't feel too long, doesn't feel too short, and while the combat certainly isn't the best around, they managed to mitigate a lot of the problems it had enough to where it actually does end up being enjoyable at times. Hell, they even tried to do interesting things with traversal, where they threw in a barnacle that you can carry around and use as a sort of of grappling hook to pull yourself up to areas where you can latch on to certain organic materials, and while it is criminally underused in this, it's still a neat feature. So all in all, Opposing Force does exactly what an expansion pack should do. It takes the elements of the original game that it's based on that worked and just does more of that, expands upon things in its own way and actually ends up doing that reasonably well, and even fixes problems that were present in the original game. And to this day, it actually remains one of the best expansion packs ever made across any game, which is especially interesting because it was Gearbox's first game, and the rest of the Half-Life series seems to think that it basically doesn't exist. The ultimate fate of the protagonist at the end of the expansion is actually left very ambiguous. We really don't know what's going to go on with that, and Valve has never done anything in the years since then to give us even a hint of what happened to Adrian Shepard. So who knows if they'll continue this storyline or not, but as for Opposing Force itself, compared to the original game, I can actually recommend this on a gameplay level, although not especially highly given that it is still limited by the factors that are present in the original Half-Life's engine and such. But if you can put up with those, this is actually enjoyable as a video game even to this day, although it's definitely aged a bit poorly compared to other first-person shooters of the era. The thing is, most of that is actually the fault of the original Half-Life and not the fault of Opposing Force. So if the original Half-Life is not much more than a historical curiosity at this point, and Opposing Force is basically what the original Half-Life should have been from the start, what about the other expansion pack, Blue Shift? Well, in that one you play as Barney Calhoun, one of the security officers that works at the Black Mesa facility, and the one you see bang on the door at the beginning of the original Half-Life, in fact, as he goes about his duties as usual until all hell breaks loose thanks to the Resonance Cascade event. He ends up stuck in an elevator when everything starts going down, and after the elevator ends up tumbling and crashing and killing both of the scientists he's with, he ends up waking up later on and having to fight his way through the Black Mesa facility as well in order to find a way out. Along the way, he'll team up with Dr. Rosenberg and his team in order to try to find a way to teleport out using an old teleporter system that they had decommissioned. So once again, we end up with a very similar storyline to both the previous expansion and the base game, and the storytelling is done in the same manner. The thing is, unlike the previous expansion pack and the base game, where all of that was still relatively new, this expansion pack came out in 2001, and by that point, the engine was looking very dated, and more importantly, we'd already gone through the Black Mesa facility twice, and now we're going through it again as some nobody security guard. And while the storyline does set up Barney Calhoun as an important character for later on in the Half-Life series, it unfortunately just doesn't bring anything new to the table. Every single thing you see in this has already been done in both the original Half-Life and Opposing Force. In fact, if you're going into Blue Shift after having played Opposing Force, it feels like a noticeable downgrade despite the HD pack that they included, because they actually did not put anything new in this expansion at all. It just reuses assets from the original Half-Life, not even Opposing Force. So you don't get access to any of the new stuff from Opposing Force, and you're stuck with a limited selection of the weapons that you had in the original Half-Life. They don't even put any new enemy types in there. You're going to be fighting the exact same enemies that you would have been fighting in the original Half-Life, not even Opposing Force. And considering how short the campaign in this expansion is, being roughly 2 hours long at absolute most, this just feels like a quick cash grab more than anything else. The original Half-Life may have been too long, but Opposing Force was just the right length, and this doesn't even manage to get to that point, but more importantly, the content it does have is just not interesting. It is a dull and lazy rehash of things that we've done before, and frankly, those times where it was done before, it was done better. Really, the only thing this brings to the table is the high definition pack, and that's not enough to justify the price of admission. I mean, sure, once you have the high definition pack, you can apply it back to the original Half-Life and Opposing Force, and all those graphics and sounds will be in those particular games, although some of them don't carry over because there's certain characters and creatures that actually do not have high definition models, so that's a bit weird. But now that all the Half-Life games are available via Steam, you actually don't even need Blue Shift to be able to install the high definition pack. So at this point, Blue Shift has become effectively pointless. I really cannot recommend it at all, even if you are a fan of Half-Life, because not only does it tell a story that didn't even really need to be told in the first place, but it doesn't bring anything new to the table that you hadn't already experienced in even the original Half-Life, and it feels like a straight-up downgrade compared to Opposing Force. So when you look at the entirety of the original Half-Life experience, both the original game itself and the expansion packs Opposing Force and Blue Shift, the only one I can actually recommend playing from a gameplay perspective is, strangely enough, the expansion pack Opposing Force. I mean, sure, anyone who is a fan of first-person shooters needs to at least try the original Half-Life to see what it was all about and see what it did, but then you're just looking at it more from a historical curiosity's sake than anything else. If you want to actually get any enjoyment out of trying to play Half-Life, then what you're going to want to do is play Opposing Force instead. And as for Blue Shift, well, just don't bother with that one at all. But regardless of my recommendations for the original game, Opposing Force, and Blue Shift, understand that the original Half-Life is really a landmark title. It would not be the same first-person shooter genre we have today without the release of the original Half-Life, and to that end, it is one of those must-own titles purely for the historical value of it. I don't really think it's possible to overstate just how influential of a game the original Half-Life was back when it originally released, and the legacy of it is in really every story-driven first-person shooter you see to this day. And really it's a shame that it has aged as poorly as it has, because it means it's really not a timeless classic like some people would claim it is. It's a classic, don't get me wrong, but it's a classic with stipulations. It's very hard to go back and play the original Half-Life. It's a lot easier to go back and play Opposing Force because they mitigated a lot of the problems that the original game had. But the original game, well, it's definitely a product of its time, and that time has long since passed. This ultimately means that even though the original Half-Life is definitely worthy of your respect for its place in the history of the first-person shooter genre, but unfortunately that sense of respect is really the only thing I can recommend doing for it at this point. It is precisely the kind of game where it is heavily remembered for one particular aspect, and if you go back and try to play it these days, then that one aspect is not enough to carry it anymore, and more importantly, going back and trying to play it again is a pretty good way of ruining any sense of nostalgia you might have had for it. Thank you all very much for watching. If you like the kind of videos I make, then please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. Every cent I get from that goes directly back into the channel in some way, whether that be getting additional equipment, or games for review, or whatever the case might be. If you can't afford to, or don't want to, then that's perfectly fine, I understand, but every bit does help. Thank you all again for watching, and I'll see you all in later videos.